Hey guys, it's Ed from Experimental Airlines. Well, I'm going to do a little unconventional video for you today. It's not a how-to video, it's kind of a how not to video. These are my mistakes in FPV. Now, I've been doing FPV for about 2 years now, and I figure I've probably spent twice as much money and 3 times as much time and effort to get where I am in FPV, which is the ability to confidently take a reliable airplane out into the field, set up my ground station, fly, not crash, not have any technical issues, bring it home with some good video. But I had many stumbling blocks along the way, and so I'll describe some of those mistakes to you in hopes that maybe you can avoid repeating some of them. Now, this is not absolute advice. Some of the things that I'll state what might apply to you, and some of them will not. And some of my choices are definitely going to differ from yours, so this is just for perspective and information. It's not absolute advice. Now, one of the most time-consuming mistakes that I made was trying to get into a too elaborate aircraft too soon into my FPV career. I started off correctly using the Axon FPV with a simple setup. It was reliable and easy to work. And then I decided I wanted to do all sorts of fancy things like carry camera payloads with co-pilots and camera operators, or fly long distances, or operate from runways with landing gear and so forth. And so I built things like the Ozone here, which actually served me quite well at Burning Man. I also built the Cygnus, which was a twin boom canard twin motor pusher, and also the Peace-Drone XR. And each of these turned out to be kind of a disappointment in their own way because they required so much nursing and so much sort of maintenance and to make them do what they wanted to do, which was far beyond what I was capable of doing at the time. It wasn't very expensive, fortunately, because I used foam board for all the construction, but it took a whole lot of time to build planes like this, only to find out they had a very narrow mission. In the case of this one, it was to fly at Burning Man, get some great video, and I haven't been able to use it since because it's just too big and it uses landing gear, and wherever I fly, I can't use landing gear. So while using complex aircraft may certainly be appropriate in certain situations, my advice, if any, would be to use the simplest, most straightforward aircraft you can to accomplish the task at hand. I've gone back to using simple aircraft like the Axon here, which is a single motor, traditional layout, or the Synapse you can see back there, which has 2 servos, very simple controls, breaks down compactly, no frills, bells, or whistles. So if you're choosing an airframe for FPV, think about what you actually really need it to do and nothing more, and go with that plane. Now, more specifically with regards to one point of complexity in aircraft is the use of landing gear for FPV. Sometimes it's a plus, sometimes it's a real bummer. Here's the Axon again. It's got simple tail dragger landing gear, and it doesn't look like much. But what you don't see is all the reinforcement and weight and complexity that happens inside the airframe to actually allow this to be mounted. But nonetheless, the Axon gets by pretty well with just simple tail dragger landing gear, and it makes for some great FPV takeoffs and landings, so no regrets there. But when you get to much larger planes, like the Ozone here, it has tricycle landing gear, which collapse, which is a cool feature, I suppose, for transportability. But all of the implications of mounting this on here, deploying it, folding it, all these screws and attachments, it adds a tremendous amount of weight just for not a whole lot of payback. So my mistake was then assuming landing gear would allow me to operate a really heavy plane with lots of payload reliably from any place, and it turns out there are not runways or fields in most of the places I fly. And so every benefit that could be had from having this landing gear went out the window. I can't actually fly this plane a lot of places. So if you're considering landing gear, if I were to recommend, I would say keep it as simple as you can, and if you don't need it, maybe think about not having landing gear at all. Conversely, the Synapse, of which this is the fuselage pod, and this is the folded up wing, operates perfectly well from grassy areas and runways and flat areas where you could use landing gear, but it also works a whole lot of other places, including bike paths and dirt roads and bushes, and if you're brave enough to hand catch your plane or otherwise retrieve it in a deep stall or something else, you don't actually need the landing gear. So think about where you're going to be flying, what you need your plane to do, and if landing gear is one of the things you can omit, I might recommend it. Another mistake I made early on, which I think a lot of FPV newbies make, is buying into the cult of endurance and distance flying. That is, as soon as you get your FPV feet wet, you want to suddenly start flying 15 miles away. Just because it's possible to do that with the technology available, it doesn't mean it's necessarily a great idea for a beginner, and it's definitely not easy to do. Just scaling up the size of a plane and giving it a high aspect ratio wing doesn't mean that you can just fly it 5 times further. There's so many other little implications that I failed to consider when trying to get into too complex and too large airplanes. There's the control to consider. You need to be able to control the airplane from a long distance. There's the video transmission that needs to go further with better antennas and or stronger transmitters, although most of that happens with the antennas. There's the safety concerns. There are the areas where you can actually have a contiguous safe area to fly, 5-10 miles away, and lose your plane and not hurt anybody, as well as find that plane 10 miles away. Can you drive or walk back there or not? And so I kind of set out my second and third and fourth planes with the idea that these will be my long distance FPV planes, and it just is difficult to make materialize. What I would recommend, if anything, is to take it a step at a time. Fly half a mile, then 1 mile, then 2, then 3 and 4. And if it takes a different plane to do that, that's fine. I would just recommend taking it in sequence. I can now fly up to 5 miles away, but it's been a stepping stone procedure rather than making my second plane this enormous complex plane, stuff it with gear, take it out to the field, and go the whole distance on one shot. Then there is the consideration of your video transmitter frequency. Now, the mistake I made was not fully considering beforehand what I expected and needed my video transmitter frequency to accomplish. I sort of stumbled into 5.8 gigahertz. This is the kind of generic kit you get from Hobby King for $60, and it seems so enticing and harmless. It's small and compact, the antennas are small, everybody's got one. It seems like, what's the harm in getting into it? Well, it's not really that expensive at first, but the capabilities are somewhat limited. The antennas suck. You have to build new antennas. You've got all the connecting gear. You've got certain adapters that you need to buy, and pretty soon it ends up being fairly expensive after all. Then what if you want to fly more than a mile away or so, or you live in a very terrain-laden area that's got a lot of buildings and mountains and things for radio signals to bounce off of? You get a lot of multipathing with this, and I quickly figured out this was not going to do what I needed it to do. And so I got into 2.4 gigahertz. And this is a great frequency with nice, modestly sized antennas. For example, these circularly polarized cloverleaf antennas. Easy to manufacture and not too draggy on the aircraft. But I failed to consider ahead of time what the RF environment was like in the area I wanted to fly, which is semi-urban. That is, open areas, but right next to the city. And there is a huge amount of noise on the 2.4 gigahertz band. So while I actually love the frequency and the gear, it just limits my ability to fly very far away in a near urban environment. So that's one thing I've failed to consider. If you're considering this, think about where you're going to be flying, what the noise will be like. And then the third step is 1.3 gigahertz here. You can see it's a little bit larger, which is arbitrary, but the cost is not much different. And the transmitters are within about 150% of the weight and size of the 5.8 gigahertz transmitter here, which is what I started with. Now this, for me, is probably going to be the right frequency because it's not very crowded. I have a ham license, and the antennas are manageably sized, particularly if you don't use the circular polarized. This is actually quite manageable inverted V, 1.3 gigahertz antenna compared with a 5.8 gigahertz circular polarized. So it's not unmanageable, despite what some people would say. The antennas can be reasonably sized. Now, I'm not advocating any one of these frequencies specifically. 5.8 gigahertz might be right for you, 2.4 might be right for you. The mistake I made is in not considering all the factors for my flying situation before I actually went out and bought all this extra stuff. So think about it carefully before you take the plunge. Any of these frequencies will do the right job in the right situation. In retrospect, one mistake that I made that's personally a mistake for me, but might not be for everyone, is hesitating getting goggles. And I hesitated like most guys would because they're expensive, and you think you can get by with an LCD and get used to it and then transition to goggles. What I really wished I had done was gotten goggles from the very beginning, used a spotter, and started off right from the goggles and just immersed myself in the experience. If you have a spotter with a buddy box, this is easily as safe as an LCD with your own ability to look up at the aircraft. As it turned out for me, I found that highly distracting. The ability to look at the LCD and my aircraft led me to do that actually quite a lot. Look at the airplane, look at the LC, look and back. And I found that to be a stumbling block to me learning to really commit to the FPV experience and fly it like a real pilot. So what I wish I had done is just suck it up, spend the $200 to $350 to buy the goggles from the beginning, and let that be my standard experience. Now there are plenty of guys, including some guys that I respect a lot, like Keith Luneau, who uses an LCD exclusively and does it quite expertly. And so my only advice would be to think about what you really want out of the experience and go down that direction and commit to it. If you think you're probably going to get goggles someday, I might say go ahead and get the goggles right away and let that be your standard FPV experience from the very beginning. Now, what about your radio control of your FPV experience? Well, my very first radio, and I still love it very much, is the Spectrum DX7. And when I started FPV, I thought, I'm going to milk this for everything it's worth. I'm going to make this 2.4 gigahertz plane do all of my needs, and how I can accomplish that in FPV is to buy a 2-watt booster and a variety of antennas, like this patch antenna if I'm really flying far away, or an omnidirectional stock antenna like this if I'm flying in close. I bought all this gear, kind of hacked it all apart, and found out, honestly, it was just a big pain in the ass, and it really didn't do what I wanted to do. I kept crashing planes. And I also couldn't fly this around my buddies because they're flying 2.4, but this is 20 times more powerful, and it just zaps them out of commission. It also required kind of hacking into my beloved radio, which was something I didn't really feel good about doing. And all in all, it was a disappointing experience for me, so I wished I hadn't done that. Now, some guys with more dedication in certain specific flying conditions might get by with that, and there are a variety of antennas you can get. If you make it work, it might work great. Now, 72 megahertz control was one option, and that would of course require buying a new radio and new receivers and so forth, and worrying about the potential for interference with other guys on that frequency. The antennas are also quite long. And then the third option, which is the one I chose and wished I had done in the first place, is a true long-range radio system. This is the DragonLink 433 megahertz control. It has reasonably sized antennas. It's a ham radio frequency, and I do have a ham radio license. And it's a very quiet frequency because there's not 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi and iPhones and everything else on it. It's not 72 megahertz. Even if there's a flying field around, there's no chance of interference. And this is frequency hopping too, so even if there's other 433 devices like a DragonLink or other UHF control devices, or even a ham radio on that, like this, which happens to operate on that band, it's going to hop right past that. So it's a pretty robust system. It also has 500 milliwatts, so it's at least 5 or more times more powerful watt per watt than a 2.4 gigahertz over-the-counter radio. And it's a much lower frequency, so watt per watt you get much more distance from it. So this became the strongest link in the chain, if you will. This is the part that I can just forget about because I know it's going to work if it's hooked up and set up and bound correctly. So I wish I had started with a true long-range system from the beginning. I happened to choose a Turnigy 9X, an inexpensive radio, to make that my integral radio, but I've also got a DragonLink that I can hook up to my DX7 as well, which is here, just by a dedicated plug that I've installed in the radio. One of the seemingly trivial but extremely important mistakes I made was not being 100% diligent to check the connectors for my control and video systems. There are SMA subminiature type A and SMA reverse polarity, or SMA RP, connectors for all these antennas, cables, transmitters, and receivers. Be extremely diligent to be certain you're getting the right one in each case, because if there's not a pin to engage the hole for the conductor, it's not going to work. Simple as that. So just make a note of yourself to pay close attention to the RP SMA versus SMA when buying gear for FPV. Now, another easy mistake to make is to get an OSD that's much more complicated than you need. My first OSD was the Nova OSD with return to home here. It was about $120. This one has a rudimentary return to home, which turns out to be a total bust. It really doesn't work. But even the concept of a return to home is something that an FPV pilot should think carefully if that's something they want. It's easy to assume it's nice to be able to just flick a button and have the plane fly home in case you fly into some clouds or you freak out or drop your radio or something bad happens. But it's far from being 100% insurance policy. it could lead you to do certain things like fly irresponsibly in places you really shouldn't. Too far away, too high, too low, and so forth. So my recommendation would be to think hard before you spend the extra money for an OSD with return to home. The second OSD was a super simple OSD from Hobby King. It's $10, and all it gives you is voltage and a timer. And that voltage is probably your most crucial flight instrument that you've got. It tells you when to come home before your battery's dead and your plane crashes somewhere far away. It's incredibly easy to hook up. Took about 10 minutes, and it gives me probably 50% of all the value of information that could possibly occur from an OSD. The third one I bought was a Skylark OSD. It was about $110 as well. It does not have return to home. It gives me just the flight instruments and navigation information that I need and nothing more. It does not have return to home. So my recommendation, if anything, would be is when you're buying an OSD, think about just the information and functionality that you need. Don't spend a dime more than what you need to accomplish that. One mistake I made time and time again early on in my FPV career was just taking too much gear with me to the flying site, whether it be the local field or out in the desert. I would bring 2 video frequencies, or I'd bring 2 controllers, or too many planes, and I just had all this crap overflowing my ground station in my car, and inevitably the more stuff I brought, the more likely I was to forget something that was integral to either of those systems working, and so it ended up being a disappointment. So what I've done now, and what I might recommend for you, is to simplify your setup as much as possible. Have 1 or at most 2 planes, 1 ground station with 1 frequency and 1 controller, unless you have a dual setup system like I'd be crazy. But have everything that you need in a compact case or other package that you can inspect and pre-flight before you leave your house, and make sure it's all there and it all functions. The more stuff you have, the more likely you're to forget something, more likely for something to break and result in disappointment. So I recommend, and I adhere to, a philosophy of keeping it as simple as possible to accomplish the task at hand. One thing I did wrong in designing my airframes for FPV early on was to confuse collapsibility with portability. Here again is the Ozone, which has removable wings, foldable vertical stabilizers here, folding gear, and the intention was to be able to have a plane that I could take on road trips to do long endurance, long distance flights. But it turns out it's actually pretty large physically, even in its broken down state. And so though all these things were collapsible, it made this a real chore to get into my truck, in the cab, to get where I needed to go. So when I reassessed things, I designed a plane that was not only collapsible, but it was actually quite compact. And here's the Synapse wing and the Synapse fuselage pod. There are no vertical stabilizers to protrude. They fold up here. All of the electronics are contained in the pod, and this is a true road plane, and it turns out actually I do a lot of that kind of flying. Now if I had a hangar in my backyard and that's where I flew from, I would have as big a plane as I could, and I wouldn't even bother making it collapsible because I could just take it out of the hangar and fly it. So thanks for watching and listening to me go on and on about all that stuff, but I hope to think that 1 or 2 guys will get 1 or 2 good points out of this, and that will make the video all worthwhile. So if you're considering or already flying FPV, have a great time. Be sure to share your videos back, comments, and messages, and if there's anything I can do to make your experience any better, or that you can do to make my experience any better, much appreciated. Thanks for watching again. Blue skies. Take care.